Welcome back to another journey through the quieter corridors of history. Tonight we're stepping away from the thunderous battles and glorious victories you might know from textbooks to a time when the map of Europe was being redrawn by the ambitions of one man and the suffering of millions. The grand spectacle of Napoleon's conquests, those sweeping arrows, across historical maps, those triumphant paintings of cavalry charges. All of this magnificent theater was built upon a foundation of cold, and when the fate of nations rested on the shoulders of men, who often couldn't even read the names of the cities they were ordered to capture. Hungry, exhausted young men trudging through mud that seemed to stretch forever. And instead, walking alongside the countless forgotten souls who made Napoleon's empire possible, the ordinary soldiers, whose names history rarely remembers, but whose weary footsteps echo through every campaign, and the peculiar mixture of boredom and terror that filled the long hours between battles. But we also glimpsed the luxurious world that this suffering supported, the silk gowns and elaborate court rituals that continued even as soldiers' boots fell apart on distant roads. Settle back into your pillow and let your breathing slow as we travel back more than 2 centuries. Tonight, you'll discover the weight of a waterlogged uniform, the gnawing emptiness of a stomach that hasn't seen proper food in days. Close your eyes and imagine yourself drifting back through time, past the comfortable warmth of your bed, past the electric lights and central heating, back to an age when staying warm and fed required constant struggle. Picture yourself as Jean-Baptiste, a 19-year-old conscript from a small village outside Lyon. The year is 1807, and you've been marching with the grandeur for what feels like forever, though it's only been 3 weeks since you left your last encampment. Your feet have forgotten what dry socks feel like. The leather of your boots, if you can still call the cracked, sodden strips wrapped around your feet. Boots squelches with each step, creating a rhythm that matches the endless percussion of thousands of other soldiers trudging through the Polish mud. The morning began before dawn, as they always do. You were awakened not by the gentle stirring of birds or the gradual lightening of the sky. Hunger has a way of making even the most questionable provisions seem palatable, and the alternative, going without, was far worse than sharing your meal with a few insects. The constant gnawing sensation in your stomach became such a familiar companion that you almost missed it during the rare occasions when you were well fed. They were, at best, rutted tracks that turned to rivers of mud with the first substantial rain, and at worst, barely distinguishable from the surrounding countryside. Each step required a conscious effort to extract your foot from the sucking mud, and the energy expenditure was enormous. Men would collapse from exhaustion, not from the distance traveled, but from the simple mechanical effort of walking through terrain that seemed designed to trap and drain the strength from human bodies. A few personal items from home, perhaps a letter from your mother or sweetheart, a small prayer book maybe, a clay pipe if you had managed to hold on to such luxuries. There was also your portion of the tent canvas, cooking equipment shared among your squad, and whatever extra food you had managed to acquire through foraging or trading. Men who could not keep pace were left beside the road, sometimes with the vague promise that wagons would collect them later, but more often with the tacit understanding that they would either recover quickly enough to catch up with the rear guard, or they would not recover at all. Root vegetables that you would never have considered eating in your previous life became delicacies to be fought over. Apple orchards were stripped bare in minutes when the army passed through, and even the most sour, unripe fruit was treasured like gold. The ability to spot edible plants, to recognize which berries were safe to eat, to find sources of clean water, these skills became more valuable than marksmanship or drill formations. The roads of Europe were littered with the bodies of soldiers who had simply reached the end of their endurance, their final resting places marked only by the scavengers who had stripped them of anything useful before moving on. The weight of these items, seemingly insignificant individually, accumulated into a burden that pressed down on your shoulders and made every step an act of will. To them, Napoleon's grande armée was not a force of liberation or conquest, but a hungry, destructive tide that consumed everything in its path. Chickens, pigs, grain stores, firewood, anything that could feed, warm, or shelter a soldier was fair game for requisition. The official policy was to pay for what was taken, but the reality was often different. Payment, when it came at all, was frequently in the form of promissory notes that might or might not be honored by a government that was perpetually strapped for funds. In dry weather, the passage of thousands of feet and hundreds of supply wagons would kick up clouds of dust that coated everything: your clothes, your skin, your throat, in a fine, choking layer that made breathing difficult and turned even the simplest conversation into a rasping whisper. The monotony of putting one foot in front of the other, hour after hour, day after day, created a peculiar state of mental emptiness. Conversations with your fellow soldiers became increasingly rare as everyone retreated into their own private world of discomfort and endurance. The initial camaraderie of shared hardship gradually gave way to a grim determination to simply keep moving, to not be the one who fell behind. But by the sharp blast of the reveille, that harsh bugle call that cuts through whatever dreams you might have managed to cobble together during your few hours of fitful rest, the initial excitement of movement, of progress towards some grand objective, quickly gave way to a numbing monotony that seemed to leach the very thoughts from your mind. Your world contracted to the narrow space between the shoulders of the man in front of you and the sound of boots behind you, a moving corridor of blue wool and leather that stretched both forward and backward beyond the limits of your vision. Sleep, when it comes at all, arrives in snatches: an hour here, 2 hours there always, interrupted by the need to move, to pack, to march towards some distant objective that exists only in the mind of the emperor and his marshals. You rolled out of your threadbare blanket, which had spent the night slowly absorbing moisture from the ground beneath you. The Brown Bess musket, that famous weapon of Napoleonic warfare, weighed nearly 10 pounds when clean and dry. After days of marching through rain and mud, with the wood swelling and the metal components accumulating moisture and dirt, it could feel like carrying a lead weight. The cartridge box, designed to hold 40 rounds of ammunition, pressed against your hip with each step, creating a constant, dull ache that radiated up your side. The canvas tent you shared with 7 other men provided little protection from the October chill, and the air inside was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies. More often than not, this meant a thin soup made from whatever vegetables could be scrounged, perhaps, flavored with a small portion of salt pork, if supplies were good, or more commonly, just boiled water with whatever grains or roots the commissary officers had managed to procure. The bread, when available, was often so hard that it required soaking in water or wine to become edible, and even then, it frequently harbored weevils or other small creatures that had made their homes in the grain stores. Damp wool and the faint, persistent odor of gunpowder that seemed to cling to everything in army life. Your uniform, once a source of pride, with its blue wool and brass buttons, had long ago faded to a muddy brown gray, the color of endless roads and countless campaigns. The morning meal, if you were fortunate enough to receive one, consisted of whatever the foraging parties had managed to find or requisition from the local population. You learned quickly not to examine your food too closely. The march itself was a peculiar form of torture, one that revealed new cruelties with each passing mile. The roads of early 19th century Europe were not the smooth highways you might imagine. But rain was worse. The autumn and winter campaigns were particularly brutal, as the seasonal rains turned the roads into treacherous quagmires that could swallow a man up to his knees. Your equipment, the musket, the cartridge box, the knapsack containing your few personal possessions, grew heavier with each mile. Inside your knapsack, you carried the entirety of your worldly possessions. A spare shirt, if you were lucky. The psychological toll of the march was perhaps even more devastating than the physical hardships, because falling behind meant death, or worse. The armies of Napoleon moved with a relentless efficiency that had no place for the weak or the injured. The local populations, whose lands the army passed through, viewed these endless columns of soldiers with a mixture of fear and resignation. You learned to forage with the skill of a professional scavenger. The nights brought their own particular miseries. After a full day of marching, when your body was crying out for rest, the work was far from over. Tents had to be erected if you were fortunate enough to have them. Firewood had to be gathered if any could be found. The wool of your coat, once thick and warming, became thin and threadbare after months of wear. You learned to sleep standing up, leaning against your musket, during the brief halts that punctuated the march. You learned to sleep in puddles, on rocky ground, pressed against the flanks of horses for warmth. The luxury of a full night's rest in a dry place became a distant memory, something that belonged to your previous life as a civilian. Perhaps it was loyalty to the emperor, that distant figure whose genius and ambition had created this vast military machine. Perhaps it was loyalty to your fellow soldiers, the men who shared your hardships and understood your suffering in ways that no civilian ever could. Or perhaps it was simply the animal instinct to survive, to endure whatever hardships were necessary to see home again. Cities fell, territories were conquered, maps were redrawn, and empires trembled, all built upon the foundation of your aching feet and empty stomach. The rhythm of your footsteps creates a hypnotic cadence that carries you deeper into memory, away from the cold reality of the present moment, toward thoughts of home and the life you knew before you became just another face in Napoleon's vast army. History would remember the great battles, the brilliant strategies, the rise and fall of nations. But the true cost of empire was measured in the quiet suffering of men like Jean-Baptiste, whose names would never appear in the history books, but whose endurance made everything else possible. Buttons fell off and were lost in the mud, never to be replaced. News of the harvest, gossip from the village, word that your family was well, these simple communications connected you to a world beyond the endless cycle of marching and fighting. News of deaths in the family, of economic hardship, of problems that you were powerless to address from hundreds of miles away. These reports could break a man's spirit more effectively than any physical hardship. Some soldiers stopped reading letters altogether, preferring to exist in a bubble of ignorance rather than face the reality of their helplessness. You would read these letters over and over until the paper fell apart, memorizing every word, every detail of a life that seemed increasingly distant and dreamlike. Tears and holes were patched with whatever fabric could be found, creating a patchwork appearance that bore little resemblance to the smart uniforms worn by the Imperial Guard in their barracks parades. And the endless routine of cleaning and maintaining equipment had to be performed regardless of your exhaustion. Your musket, caked with mud and moisture, required careful cleaning to prevent rust and ensure it would fire when needed. Your boots, what remained of them, needed whatever repairs you could manage with the limited tools and materials at your disposal. Army surgeons, when they were available, were overwhelmed by the sheer number of sick and wounded men. Their tools were crude, their knowledge limited, and their supplies virtually non-existent. A broken bone might be set with splints made from whatever wood could be found. A fever might be treated with bloodletting or purging, treatments that often did more harm than good. Many soldiers learned to treat their own injuries with folk remedies and whatever medical knowledge they could acquire from their comrades. The cold was a constant enemy, seeping through your uniform and into your very bones. Sleep, when it finally came, was a precious commodity that had to be stolen in whatever moments presented themselves. Disease was a constant companion, more deadly than enemy bullets. Dysentery, typhus, and a dozen other ailments swept through the ranks with devastating regularity. The close quarters, poor sanitation, and weakened immune systems of the soldiers created perfect conditions for epidemic illness. Men who had survived multiple battles would be felled by a simple infection, their bodies too exhausted to fight off even minor ailments. The medical care available to common soldiers was primitive at best. Yet through all of this suffering, through the endless miles of mud and the constant gnawing of hunger, there was still something that kept you moving forward. The letters from home, when they managed to reach you through the chaos of constantly moving armies, were treasures beyond price. But even these connections to home could become sources of pain. The march continued, day after day, week after week, following the grand strategic vision of Napoleon Bonaparte. As you trudge through another day of endless marching, your mind begins to wander, drifting between the immediate discomfort of your situation and dreams of the warm hearth you left behind. As the weary footsteps of countless soldiers fade into the distant echo of history, we turn our attention to one man whose name rose above the anonymous masses, Marshal Ney, the son of a barrel maker who would become known as the Brave Day Braves, the bravest of the brave. His story is one of meteoric rise and tragic fall, a life that embodied both the promise and the ultimate betrayal of Napoleon's empire. Imagine yourself in the small town of Sarre-Louis, in what was then the French frontier region of Lorraine. On a crisp January morning in 1769, the air is sharp with winter cold, and smoke rises from the chimneys of modest homes where craftsmen and their families begin another day of honest labor. In one such house, Pierre Ney, a cooper by trade, tends to his barrels while his wife, Marguerite, cradles their newborn son, a child who will grow up to command armies and shape the foundations of Europe. Michel Ney's early years were unremarkable, in the way that many great lives begin quietly, without fanfare, shaped by the steady rhythm of provincial life. His father's workshop was filled with the comforting sounds of honest work, the scraping of planes against oak staves, the hammering of iron hoops, the satisfied grunt of a craftsman inspecting his finished product. Young Michel grew up with calloused hands and a practical understanding of how things were made, skills that would serve him well in the improvised world of military campaigns. The France of Ney's youth was a kingdom still bound by the rigid hierarchies of the old regime, where birth determined destiny more surely than talent or ambition. The son of a barrel maker might hope to become a successful craftsman himself, perhaps even a small merchant, but the heights of military command were reserved for those born to nobility. The revolution that would shatter these certainties was still years away, existing only as whispered grievances in taverns and the theoretical musings of philosophers. At 18, Marshal Ney made the decision that would define his life. He enlisted in the army, not as an officer, for his humble birth precluded such aspirations, but as a common soldier in the Hussars, those light cavalry regiments that served as the eyes and ears of larger armies. Picture him in 1787, a young man with the broad shoulders and steady hands of his father's trade, learning to sit a horse and wield a saber with the same methodical attention to detail that had once shaped barrel staves. The army of the old regime was a harsh school that taught lessons in endurance, discipline, and the brutal realities of military life. Ney learned to sleep in the saddle, to find water in country that seemed bone dry, to read the subtle signs that distinguished a safe road from an ambush waiting to happen. But more than these practical skills, he learned something that would define his entire career, the art of inspiring confidence in desperate men. There was something in Ney's manner, a quality that couldn't be taught in any military academy, that made soldiers willing to follow him into situations where survival seemed impossible. Perhaps it was the way he shared their hardships without complaint, or the calm certainty with which he faced danger, or simply the fact that he had risen from their own ranks and understood their struggles in ways that aristocratic officers never could. Whatever the source, this quality would carry him from the ranks to the highest levels of military command. The revolution, when it came, swept away the old certainties like a spring flood clearing debris from a riverbank. The rigid hierarchies that had defined French society for centuries dissolved overnight, replaced by the intoxicating promise that merit might triumph over birth, that a barrel-maker's son might rise as high as his talents could carry him. For Marshal Ney, this transformation was nothing short of miraculous. In the space of a few years, he rose from sergeant to lieutenant to captain, each promotion earned through displays of courage and tactical brilliance that astonished his superiors. The revolution brought more than opportunity. It brought war. The monarchies of Europe, terrified by the example of France, formed coalition after coalition dedicated to crushing the revolutionary spirit before it could spread beyond French borders. For more than a decade, France found itself surrounded by enemies, fighting for its very survival against forces that seemed to stretch from the Atlantic to the Ural. These were the wars that forged Marshal Ney's reputation, campaigns fought across the broken landscape of Central Europe, where armies moved like nomadic tribes, living off the land and leaving devastation in their wake. You can picture him in 1794, now a young officer leading cavalry charges against Austrian positions in the Low Countries, his uniform splattered with mud and blood, his voice hoarse from shouting orders above the din of battle. The theoretical lessons of military textbooks meant nothing in the chaos of actual combat, where split-second decisions could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe. It was during these early campaigns that Ney first encountered the young artillery officer who would dominate his later life, Napoleon Bonaparte. Even then, there was something magnetic about the Corsican, a quality that drew ambitious men into his orbit like planets circling the sun. Ney recognized in Napoleon a military genius that transcended conventional thinking, a commander who could see possibilities where others saw only obstacles. The relationship between Ney and Napoleon was complex, built on mutual respect, but complicated by the fundamental differences in their backgrounds and temperaments. Napoleon was a creature of intellect and calculation, a man who viewed warfare as a form of chess played with human pieces. Ney was more instinctive, a soldier who led by example rather than theory, who inspired through shared danger rather than brilliant strategy. Yet despite these differences, or perhaps because of them, they formed a partnership that would reshape the map of Europe. Napoleon seized power in 1799. Ney was among the first to recognize the significance of the moment. The Directory, that chaotic experiment in Republican government, had proven incapable of providing the stability that France desperately needed. The country was exhausted by a decade of war and revolution, hungry for the strong leadership that only a military dictator could provide. Ney threw his support behind Napoleon, not out of personal ambition, but from a genuine belief that France needed the firm hand of a proven leader. The rewards for this loyalty were immediate and substantial. Napoleon, who valued ability above all else, recognized in Ney a commander who could be trusted with the most difficult assignments. When other generals hesitated or equivocated, Ney moved forward with the kind of decisive action that Napoleon prized. In 1804, when Napoleon crowned himself emperor, Ney was among the first to receive the newly created title of Marshal of France, an honor that elevated him to the highest ranks of the military hierarchy. But with elevation came responsibility. And with responsibility came the weight of command decisions that would haunt Ney for the rest of his life. Picture him in 1805, standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside the Austrian town of Elchinin, watching as his men prepared for what would become one of the most brutal assaults of the Ulm campaign. The bridge across the Danube had to be taken, regardless of the cost, and Ney knew that many of the faces around him would not see another sunset. The assault on Elchinin was typical of Ney's style of leadership: direct, personal, and utterly without regard for his own safety. While other commanders might have directed the attack from a safe distance, Ney led from the front, his presence inspiring his men to feats of courage that surprised even themselves. The bridge was taken, the Austrian position collapsed, And another chapter was added to the growing legend of Marshal Ney, the marshal who never asked his men to go where he would not lead. Victory followed victory as Napoleon's armies swept across Europe, rewriting the political map with each campaign. At Jena, Ney's corps shattered the Prussian left wing with a ferocity that left survivors talking in hushed tones about the demonic intensity of the French attack. At Friedland, his tactical brilliance helped deliver one of Napoleon's most complete victories, effectively ending Prussian resistance and forcing the proud kingdom to sue for peace. But it was during the retreat from Moscow that Ney earned his greatest glory and sealed his tragic fate. The year 1812 had begun with such promise, as Napoleon assembled the largest army in European history for the invasion of Russia. 600,000 men from across the empire marched east with the confidence of conquerors, expecting to crush Russian resistance within a matter of months. Instead, they found themselves drawn into a vast, empty land that seemed to swallow armies whole. The retreat from Moscow was a masterpiece of military disaster, a catastrophe so complete that it defied comprehension. Of the 600,000 men who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 30,000 would return in fighting condition. The rest perished from cold, hunger, disease, and the constant harassment of Cossack raiders who struck like wolves at the edges of the disintegrating army. It was during this nightmare march that Ney's true character revealed itself. While other commanders abandoned their men and fled for safety, Ney remained with the rear guard, fighting a series of desperate actions that allowed thousands of soldiers to escape who would otherwise have been lost. Day after day, he held together units that were more dead than alive, using his personal magnetism to keep men moving when every instinct told them to simply lie down in the snow and wait for death. The Battle of Krasnoy, fought in the bitter cold of November 1812, was Ney's finest hour. Surrounded by overwhelming Russian forces, cut off from the main army, he performed what Napoleon would later call the most magnificent feat of arms in military history. With fewer than 6,000 men, most of them wounded or sick, he fought his way through enemy lines and rejoined the retreating army, bringing with him the survivors of 3 corps that had been written off as lost. Napoleon's reaction to Ney's return was characteristic of their complex relationship. Embracing his marshal with tears in his eyes, the emperor declared that Ney was worth an entire army. But even as he celebrated his subordinate's heroism, Napoleon was already calculating how to use this achievement for his own purposes, how to spin the disaster of the Russian campaign into a narrative of French resilience and courage. The years that followed were a series of increasingly desperate campaigns as Napoleon's empire crumbled under the weight of its own ambitions. The Allies Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had learned from their earlier defeats and now fought with the kind of coordinated strategy that the French had previously monopolized. At Leipzig, the Battle of the Nations, Ney commanded the rear guard of another disastrous retreat, holding off enemy forces while Napoleon's dreams of European domination dissolved in the smoke of burning cities. But it was Napoleon's first abdication in 1814 that truly tested Ney's loyalty. The emperor, who had been the center of his world for 15 years, was suddenly gone, exiled to the tiny island of Elba, leaving behind a throne occupied by the restored Bourbon monarchy. For the first time in his adult life, Ney was forced to choose between competing loyalties, his oath to the crown of France, or his personal devotion to the man who had made his career possible. The decision to support the Bourbon restoration was not made lightly. Ney genuinely believed that France needed peace more than it needed glory, that the country was exhausted by decades of war and revolution. When he knelt before Louis XVIII and swore allegiance to the restored monarchy, he was sincere in his desire to serve France under its legitimate king. The title of Duke of Elchingen, granted by the grateful Bourbons, was more than a reward for his military service. was recognition of his commitment to the new order. But then came the news that would destroy everything Napoleon had escaped from Elba and was marching on Paris. The 100 Days, as historians would later call this brief period, represented the final gamble of a man who could not accept the limitations of ordinary life. For Ney, it represented an impossible choice between competing loyalties that would ultimately cost him everything. The meeting between Ney and Napoleon at Auxerre in March 1815 was a scene worthy of classical tragedy. The emperor, still possessing that magnetic charisma that had conquered Europe, appealed to his old martial sense of glory and adventure. France, he argued, had made a mistake in accepting the Bourbon Restoration. The people longed for the return of their true emperor, the man who had given them victories and made them the masters of Europe. Ney's capitulation was as dramatic as everything else in his life. The man who had promised to bring Napoleon back to Paris in an iron cage instead found himself once again serving under the tricolor banner, his marshal's baton restored, his regiments ready to march wherever their emperor might lead them. The decision was both inevitable and tragic inevitable, because Ney could never truly abandon the man who had made his career. Tragic because it sealed his fate with mathematical certainty. Waterloo fought on a muddy field in Belgium on June 1815 was the final chapter in both Napoleon's career and Ney's life. The battle was a series of might-have-beens and fatal hesitations, a day when small decisions accumulated into catastrophic consequences. Ney, commanding the French cavalry, led charge after charge against the British squares, his personal courage undimmed by the hopelessness of the situation. Picture him in the late afternoon of that terrible day, his uniform torn and bloodied, his horse shot from under him, still trying to rally his men for one more assault against positions that could not be taken. The sound of Prussian artillery was growing closer. Napoleon's last reserves were committed and broken, and the dream of restored empire was dying in the mud of a Belgian battlefield. Yet Ney fought on, driven by a code of honor that would not permit surrender while his emperor still had need of him. The defeat at Waterloo was absolute, final, and irreversible. Napoleon's political career was over, his military genius proven mortal, his empire reduced to the dimensions of a prison island in the South Atlantic. But for Ney, the consequences were even more severe. As one of the most prominent supporters of the 100 Days, he was marked for destruction by the restored Bourbon monarchy, which could not afford to show mercy to traitors who had broken their oaths of allegiance. The trial of Marshal Ney was a foregone conclusion, a legal proceeding designed to provide a veneer of justice to what was essentially a political execution. The charges were technically correct. He had indeed broken his oath to Louis XVIII, had indeed supported Napoleon's return, but the deeper truth was that Ney was being sacrificed to demonstrate the consequences of defying the new order. His past services to France, his heroism in a dozen campaigns, his genuine patriotism, none of these weighed against the political necessity of his destruction. On the morning of boarding, December 7, 1815, Marshal Ney stood before a firing squad in the gardens of the Luxembourg Palace, facing the same kind of violent death that had claimed so many of his soldiers over the years. His final words were characteristic of the man. He refused a blindfold, declaring that he had faced death too many times to fear it now, and gave the order to fire to the soldiers who were about to kill him. The execution of Marshal Ney was more than the death of a single man. It was the symbolic end of the revolutionary era that had promised to overthrow the old order and replace it with something based on merit rather than birth. The barrel maker's son who had risen to command armies was dead, and with him died the dream that humble origins need not limit human achievement. Yet even in death, Ney's story continued to resonate through the imagination of his countrymen. Legends grew around his memory, tales of last-minute escapes and secret identities that reflected the popular refusal to accept that such a man could simply be executed like a common criminal. These stories, whether true or false, testified to the enduring power of his example, the idea that courage and loyalty could elevate even the humblest individual to greatness. As we reflect on the life of Marshal Ney, we see reflected the larger tragedy of Napoleon's empire, the way that personal loyalty could become a trap, the way that military glory could mask political catastrophe, the way that the pursuit of honor could lead to destruction. His story reminds us that history is made not just by the great figures whose names dominate the textbooks, but by the countless individuals who make choices, sometimes impossible choices, that shape the course of events. The marshal who had once commanded armies now rests in a simple grave, his earthly ambitions reduced to dust and memory. But his story lives on, a reminder of an age when the map of Europe was redrawn by the force of individual will, when the son of a craftsman could rise to command nations, and when loyalty to a fallen emperor could cost a man everything he had gained through a lifetime of service. Napoleon single quotes S stolen art, and the missing masterpieces priceless works, looted and scattered across Europe. As Marshal Ney's story fades into the quiet corners of history, we turn our attention to another legacy of Napoleon's conquests, one that reveals itself not in the clash of armies or the fall of dynasties, but in the silent halls of museums and the shadowed alcoves of private collections. This is the story of art as the spoils of war, of masterpieces torn from their homes and scattered across a continent, of cultural treasures that became pawns in the grand game of empire. Picture yourself walking through the Louvre in the year 1810, at the height of Napoleon's power. The galleries stretch before you like a river of marble and gold, their walls lined with paintings and sculptures that represent the accumulated artistic heritage of Europe. But as you move from room to room, examining the labels beside each masterpiece, you begin to notice something curious. Many of these works bear not the mark of French creation, but the names of Italian masters, Flemish painters, German sculptors, artists from across the conquered territories of the empire. The transformation of the Louvre from a royal palace into a public museum was one of the Revolution's most ambitious cultural projects, a deliberate effort to democratize art and make the treasures of the aristocracy available to ordinary citizens. But under Napoleon, this noble vision became entangled with the more practical business of conquest and plunder. The museum that had been conceived as a temple to human creativity became, in many ways, a monument to the systematic looting of Europe's cultural heritage. The process began almost immediately after Napoleon's first successful campaigns in northern Italy. In 1796, as French armies swept through the Italian peninsula, they carried with them not just military objectives, but cultural ones as well. The young General Bonaparte, barely 27 years old, had already demonstrated his appreciation for art and antiquities, and he understood instinctively that cultural treasures were as valuable as territorial conquests, perhaps more so. Imagine yourself in Milan in the summer of 1796, watching as French commissioners arrive at the Brera Palace to negotiate the terms of the armistice with the defeated Austrians. The military clauses are straightforward enough: the withdrawal of troops, the payment of indemnities, the recognition of French authority. But buried within these documents are other provisions, seemingly minor but ultimately transformative, requiring the defeated powers to surrender specific artworks to the French Republic. The selection of these works was not random or arbitrary. Napoleon had surrounded himself with scholars and connoisseurs who understood the value of what they were acquiring. Dominique Vivant-Danon, the future director of the Louvre, accompanied many of these early campaigns, his trained eye identifying the masterpieces that would enhance France's cultural prestige. The process was systematic, almost scientific in its thoroughness, as French agents methodically catalogued and requisitioned the artistic treasures of conquered territories. from the monasteries of northern Italy came paintings by Leonardo da Vinci, including studies for works that had been lost or destroyed over the centuries. The frescoes were too fragile to move, but the portable paintings, the drawings, the small sculptures, these could be carefully packed and transported back to Paris, where they would take their place in the growing collection of the Louvre. Each work represented not just aesthetic value, but political symbolism, tangible proof of French cultural superiority and the rightness of their cause. The Vatican itself was not immune to these cultural requisitions. In 1797, as French forces occupied Rome, Pope Pius VI found himself in the impossible position of negotiating with conquerors who demanded not just political submission but artistic tribute. The Treaty of Tolentino, signed in February of that year, included provisions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. The Papal States were required to surrender 100 paintings, busts, vases, and statues to be selected by French commissioners. Picture the scene in the Vatican galleries as French experts moved through the collections, their notebooks filled with careful descriptions and evaluations. Here was the Apollo Belvedere, that magnificent marble sculpture that had been considered one of the greatest achievements of ancient art. Here was the Laocoon, with its powerful depiction of human struggle against divine fate. These works, which had been the centerpiece of papal collections for centuries, were now crated and loaded onto wagons for the journey north to Paris. The process was not without its difficulties. Many of the works were large and fragile, requiring elaborate scaffolding and specialized transport. The Apollo Belvedere, for instance, had to be carefully removed from its pedestal and wrapped in layers of protective material before being loaded onto a specially constructed wagon. The journey from Rome to Paris took months, with the convoy stopping frequently to check on the condition of its precious cargo. But the cultural looting extended far beyond Italy. As Napoleon's armies moved into Germany, the Low Countries, and eventually into Austria and Prussia, they carried with them the same systematic approach to artistic acquisition. The great collections of European nobility accumulated over centuries of patronage and collecting were systematically dismantled and redistributed according to the political needs of the French Empire. In Vienna, the imperial collections of the Habsburgs provided a particularly rich source of artistic treasures. Paintings by Dürer, Rubens, and Van Dyck were carefully selected and shipped to Paris, along with ancient sculptures, medieval manuscripts, and decorative objects that represented the accumulated cultural heritage of the Holy Roman Empire. Each work was documented, catalogued, and assigned a place in the growing collection of the Louvre, which was rapidly becoming the largest and most comprehensive art museum in the world. The process was justified, in French eyes, by the rhetoric of cultural liberation. These masterpieces, they argued, had been locked away in private collections, accessible only to the aristocratic elite who possessed neither the knowledge nor the appreciation to properly value them. In the democratic galleries of the Louvre, they would be available to all citizens, serving the cause of education and cultural advancement that was at the heart of the revolutionary project. Napoleon himself took a personal interest in these acquisitions, often visiting the museum to inspect the latest arrivals and discuss their placement with the curators. His correspondence from this period reveals a man who saw art not just as decoration, but as a tool of political power, a way of demonstrating French cultural supremacy and the benefits of enlightened rule. The Louvre, he declared, would become the greatest museum in the world, a testament to the achievements of the French people and the wisdom of their emperor. But for every masterpiece that found its way to the Louvre, there were others that simply disappeared, casualties of the chaos and confusion that accompanied military conquest. Private collections were scattered, with individual works ending up in the hands of soldiers, administrators, and merchants who had neither the knowledge nor the inclination to preserve them properly. Some paintings were damaged by improper handling, others were lost entirely, and still others were sold on the black market to collectors who asked no questions about their provenance. The story of the horses of San Marco provides a particularly poignant example of how cultural treasures became entangled with political symbolism. These 4 bronze horses, dating from classical antiquity, had stood above the entrance to St. Mark's Basilica in Venice for centuries, symbols of the city's wealth and independence. When French forces occupied Venice in 1797, the horses were among the first treasures to be requisitioned, their removal from the basilica marking the end of the Venetian Republic's 1,000-year independence. The horses arrived in Paris in 1798, where they were installed atop the Arc de Triomphe du Carrousel as symbols of French victory and cultural achievement. But their presence in Paris was also a reminder of something darker, the way that military conquest could erase the cultural identity of defeated peoples, reducing their most precious symbols to mere trophies in a conqueror's collection. Systematic nature of this cultural looting becomes even more apparent when we examine the detailed inventories that French administrators compiled of their acquisitions. These documents, preserved in the archives of the Louvre and other French institutions, reveal the extraordinary scope of the operation. From the great museums and churches of Europe came not just paintings and sculptures, but also manuscripts, scientific instruments, natural history specimens, and archaeological artifacts that represented the accumulated knowledge and cultural heritage of entire civilizations. The library of the University of Bologna, for instance, lost thousands of rare manuscripts that were shipped to Paris to enhance the collections of the Bibliothèque Nationale. The natural history collections of Vienna and Florence were systematically pillaged for specimens that would stock the galleries of the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle. Even scientific instruments, telescopes, microscopes, and other tools of learning were requisitioned as part of the cultural tribute demanded from defeated powers. Yet, as Napoleon's empire expanded, the practical difficulties of managing these vast collections became increasingly apparent. The Louvre was running out of space, and the quality of care that the masterpieces received was sometimes questionable. Storage areas were overcrowded, and many works were damaged by exposure to humidity, temperature changes, and simple neglect. The very success of the looting operation was creating problems the French administrators were unprepared to handle. But more troubling still were the growing questions about the legitimacy of these acquisitions. Even within France, there were voices raised in protest against the systematic stripping of Europe's cultural heritage. Some scholars argued that art belonged to all humanity, not just to the nation that happened to possess the strongest armies. Others pointed out that the context in which these works had been created, the churches, palaces, and public spaces they had been designed to adorn, was as important as the works themselves. The defeat of Napoleon in 1814 brought these questions to a head. The Allies who had fought to overthrow the French Empire were not content simply to redraw the political map of Europe. They also demanded the return of the cultural treasures that had been looted over the previous 2 decades. The Congress of Vienna, which met to settle the terms of the post-Napoleonic order, included provisions for the repatriation of artworks to their countries of origin, the process of returning these treasures was as complex and controversial as their original acquisition had been. Many works had been in Paris for so long that they had become integrated into the fabric of French cultural life. French scholars and museum officials argued that the masterpieces were better cared for in the Louvre than they would be in their countries of origin, and that the public benefit of keeping them in Paris outweighed the claims of their original owners. But the Allies were insistent, and throughout 1815 and 1816, wagons loaded with paintings, sculptures, and other treasures made their way back. Across Europe, the Apollo Belvedere returned to the Vatican. The horses of San Marco were restored to their place above St. Mark's Basilica, and hundreds of other works found their way back to their original homes. Yet the process was incomplete. Many works remained in France, either because their ownership was disputed or because they had been so thoroughly integrated into French collections that their removal would have been impractical. The story of Napoleon's cultural looting raises questions that resonate even today. Who owns the cultural heritage of humanity? What obligations do conquerors have to preserve the artistic treasures of the peoples they defeat? How do we balance the educational value of great museum collections against the rights of communities to control their own cultural patrimony? These questions are not merely academic. In museums around the world, there are still works that bear the hidden history of Napoleonic conquest, masterpieces whose presence in far-off galleries is a reminder of the complex relationship between art and power. The Louvre itself, despite the massive repatriations of the post-Napoleonic period, still contains works that were acquired during the empire. Their provenance, a testament to the enduring legacy of cultural conquest. As you walk through any great museum today, you are walking through the accumulated history of human creativity, but also through the history of power, conquest, and cultural displacement. Each masterpiece tells not just the story of its creation, but the story of its journey through time, the hands that have possessed it, the conflicts that have shaped its fate. The paintings and sculptures are silent witnesses to the rise and fall of empires, the shifting boundaries of nations, the endless human struggle to create meaning and beauty in a world of violence and chaos. The legacy of Napoleon's cultural conquests extends far beyond the individual works that were looted and returned. It established precedents for the systematic acquisition of cultural treasures that would be followed by other conquerors in later centuries. It raised questions about the relationship between military power and cultural authority that continue to shape debates about museum collections and cultural repatriation. And it demonstrated the way that art can become both a symbol of national identity and a tool of political domination. In the quiet galleries of the world's great museums, surrounded by the masterpieces of human creativity, we can still hear the echoes of those distant conflicts, the sound of wagon wheels carrying treasures across Europe, the voices of conquerors and conquered arguing over the fate of humanity's cultural heritage. The paintings hang silently on their walls, beautiful and eternal, but they carry within them the memory of all the hands that have possessed them, all the conflicts that have shaped their journey through time. Segment 4. Luxury and Intrigue. Inside Josephine's court silks, scandals, and secret messages hidden in fans. As the echoes of cultural conquest fade into the marble halls of distant museums, we turn our attention to a world that existed in stark contrast to the muddy boots and empty stomachs of Napoleon's soldiers. The glittering court of Empress Josephine, where silk replaced canvas, perfume masked the smell of gunpowder, and the most dangerous battles were fought with whispered words and carefully choreographed gestures. Imagine yourself stepping through the golden doors of Château de Malmaison on a warm evening in 1807, the height of the empire's power. The air is heavy with the scent of jasmine and roses from Josephine's famous gardens, mingling with the more exotic fragrances of sandalwood and bergamot that drift from the carefully arranged reception rooms. The sound of your footsteps is muffled by carpets woven in the imperial workshops of Aubusson, their intricate patterns depicting scenes of triumph and glory that mirror the political aspirations of the court. That the contrast with the world of common soldiers could not be more complete. Where they knew hunger, here excess was the rule. Where they struggled with threadbare uniforms, here silk and velvet were commonplace. Where they slept on muddy ground, here every detail of comfort had been considered and perfected by artisans, whose only concern was the creation of beauty and luxury. Josephine herself, born Marie Rose Tacher de la Pagerie on a sugar plantation in Martinique, embodied the transformation that Napoleon's empire had made possible. Her journey from colonial obscurity to imperial grandeur was as remarkable as any military campaign, a story of survival, adaptation, and the careful cultivation of influence in a world where a woman's power depended entirely on her ability to navigate the complex currents of male ambition. Picture her in her private apartments, preparing for another evening of diplomatic entertainment. At 43, she retained the ethereal beauty that had first captivated Napoleon, but it was now enhanced by the sophisticated artifice that only unlimited wealth could provide. Her morning toilette was a ritual that began before dawn, as servants arranged the day's selection of gowns, jewelry, and accessories according to the political and social requirements of her scheduled dot. The gowns themselves were masterpieces of the dressmaker's art, created by the finest seamstresses in Paris using silks imported from Lyon and velvets from Italy. Each dress was a statement of imperial power, its cut and decoration carefully calculated to convey messages about France's cultural supremacy and the Empress's personal authority. The neoclassical styles favored by Josephine were not merely fashion choices, they were political statements that aligned the French court with the civilizations of ancient Greece and Rome, claiming for Napoleon's empire the same cultural authority that had once belonged to the classical world. But the true complexity of Josephine's world revealed itself not in her wardrobe, but in the intricate web of social relationships that defined court life. Every gesture, every glance, every seemingly casual conversation carried potential political significance. The ladies who attended her daily receptions were not simply companions, they were the wives, daughters, and mistresses of the men who controlled the empire's destiny. Their conversations, apparently focused on fashion and gossip, were actually exchanges of information that could influence military campaigns, diplomatic negotiations, and the fate of nations. The language of the court was a sophisticated code that required years of study to master. A fan held at a particular angle could convey messages that would be dangerous to speak aloud. The choice of jewels for a particular occasion could signal political alliances or personal animosities. Even the arrangement of furniture in the reception rooms was a form of communication, with the placement of chairs and sofas indicating the relative importance of different guests and the Empress's current political preferences. Consider the evening receptions that Josephine hosted 3 times a week throughout the social season. These events, attended by the cream of European society, were carefully choreographed performances that served multiple purposes simultaneously. On the surface, they were elegant social gatherings where cultured men and women could enjoy music, conversation, and the finest luxuries that the empire could provide. But beneath this veneer of civilization, they were intelligence-gathering operations, diplomatic conferences, and exercises in political control. The guest list for each reception was compiled with the same strategic precision that Napoleon brought to his military campaigns. Foreign ambassadors were seated next to French officials who needed to gauge their government's intentions. The wives of provincial administrators were introduced to Parisian society women who could provide information about local conditions. Visiting merchants were placed in conversation with court ladies who might learn about trade opportunities or potential sources of economic intelligence. The entertainment at these gatherings was equally calculated. The musicians who performed were often chosen for their nationality as much as their talent. Italian singers to flatter Austrian diplomats, German pianists to appeal to Prussian visitors, French composers to demonstrate cultural superiority. The songs themselves were selected with care, their lyrics and melodies designed to evoke specific emotional responses that might influence political negotiations or personal relationships. Josephine's gardens at Malmaison were another theater for these elaborate games of influence and information. The Empress had transformed the grounds into a botanical wonderland, importing rare plants from around the world and creating landscapes that served as both private retreats and public demonstrations of French power. The roses that became her signature were not simply beautiful flowers. They were symbols of the empire's ability to command resources from across the globe, to transform even the most exotic specimens into ornaments of French civilization. But the gardens also served more practical purposes. The network of paths and pavilions provided numerous opportunities for private conversations that could not be overheard by the wrong people. Foreign diplomats could be discreetly approached while apparently admiring the flower beds. Military officers could receive confidential instructions while strolling through the arbors. The Empress herself often conducted her most sensitive business while walking among her roses, using the beauty of the surroundings to disarm potential adversaries and encourage candid discussion. The complexity of Josephine's position was heightened by her relationship with Napoleon himself. Their marriage, which had begun as a passionate love affair, had evolved into something far more complicated, political partnership that was both mutually beneficial and increasingly strained. The emperor needed Josephine's social skills and her ability to manage the complex world of court politics, but he also resented her independence and her refusal to be completely subordinated to his will. Their private conversations, conducted in the imperial apartments at the Tuileries or in the intimate spaces of Malmaison, were exercises in diplomatic negotiation as much as marital discourse. Josephine understood that her power depended on her ability to remain useful to Napoleon, to provide him with information and insights that he could not obtain through his military or administrative channels. She cultivated relationships with people who were outside his normal sphere of influence: artists, writers, foreign nobles, and the wives of men who might be reluctant to speak candidly to the emperor himself. The Empress's correspondence, much of it preserved in the archives of the Napoleonic period, reveals the extraordinary scope of her intelligence network. She maintained regular communication with informants across Europe, receiving reports on everything from troop movements to court gossip to economic conditions in distant provinces. Her letters, written in a style that appeared casual and personal, actually contained coded information that was vital to the empire's political and military operations. The question of succession haunted Josephine's every waking moment. Her inability to provide Napoleon with a male heir was not just a personal tragedy. It was a political crisis that threatened the very foundation of the empire. The emperor's growing desire for a divorce was an open secret at court, discussed in whispers and coded references that everyone understood, but no one dared address directly. The irony of Josephine's position was that her success in creating a sophisticated court culture had made her indispensable to the empire's prestige, while simultaneously highlighting her failure to fulfill her most basic dynastic obligation. The foreign diplomats who attended her receptions were impressed by the refinement and elegance of French court life, but they also noted the absence of imperial children and drew their own conclusions about the dynasty's long-term viability. Other women of the court, while officially subservient to the empress, were actually her rivals in a complex game of influence and survival. Each sought to position herself as a potential replacement for Josephine, either as Napoleon's wife or as the power behind whatever woman might eventually occupy that position. The competition was subtle but fierce, conducted through the medium of fashion, cultural patronage, and the careful cultivation of relationships with influential men. Pauline Borghese, Napoleon's sister, represented one pole of this rivalry. Beautiful, intelligent, and utterly without moral scruples, she used her family connection to challenge Josephine's authority while maintaining plausible deniability about her intentions. Her salons were alternative centers of power within the court, gathering places for those who were dissatisfied with the empress's policies or simply sought to hedge their bets about the future. The wives of Napoleon's marshals formed another faction, women who had risen from relative obscurity to positions of influence through their husbands' military achievements. They understood power in more direct terms than the aristocratic ladies who surrounded Josephine. and they were often more willing to take risks in pursuit of their goals. Their conversations, when they thought themselves unobserved, revealed a harder edge to court life, a recognition that all their luxury and privilege depended on continued military success and political stability, that the daily routine of court life was an elaborate performance that required constant attention and energy. Each morning brought new challenges, diplomatic crises that needed to be managed through social channels, family disputes that threatened to spill over into political conflicts, financial problems that had to be solved without attracting unwanted attention. The Empress's schedule was planned with military precision, each appointment and engagement calculated to advance specific political objectives. The afternoon salons were particularly important, as they provided opportunities for informal diplomacy that could not be conducted through official channels. Foreign visitors were encouraged to speak candidly about their government's policies, often revealing information that would be useful in subsequent negotiations. French officials could be subtly influenced through conversations that appeared to be purely social, their opinions shaped by arguments that seemed to emerge naturally from the discussion. The evening entertainments were the culmination of each day's political maneuvering. The guest list, the seating arrangements, the choice of music and refreshments, every detail was designed to create specific interactions and outcomes. Success was measured not in applause or social acclaim, but in the intelligence gathered, the alliances formed, and the political objectives advanced. As the years passed and Napoleon's empire reached its zenith, the contrast between the world of the court and the reality of military campaigning became increasingly stark. While soldiers died in the snows of Russia and the mud of Germany, the ladies of Josephine's circle continued their elaborate games of influence and intrigue, their silk gowns and jeweled fans seeming almost obscene in their irrelevance to the empire's real struggles. Yet, in many ways, the court's activities were as essential to the empire's survival as any military campaign. The information gathered in Josephine's drawing rooms, the alliances formed over elaborate dinners, the diplomatic relationships maintained through carefully choreographed social events, all of these contributed to the complex web of power that held Napoleon's empire together. The Empress herself, despite her personal vulnerabilities and political limitations, had created something unprecedented in European history, a court that combined the refinement of the old aristocracy with the energy and ambition of the revolutionary era. Her receptions brought together people who would never have met under the old regime, creating new forms of social and political interaction that reflected the transformed world of post-revolutionary Europe. But as you stand in the candlelit splendor of Malmaison, surrounded by the whispered conversations and rustling silk of Josephine's world, you can already sense the fragility of this elaborate construction. The empire that supported such luxury was built on foundations of military conquest and political control that could not be sustained indefinitely. The contrast between the court's artificial perfection and the brutal realities of European warfare was becoming too stark to ignore. The fans that flutter in the warm evening air carry more than coded messages. They carry the secrets of a world that is already beginning to dissolve, its elaborate rituals and careful hierarchies destined to collapse along with the empire that created them. The silk gowns and jeweled tiaras are beautiful, but they are also memorials to a dream of power that was always more fragile than it appeared, more dependent on the continued success of distant armies than its inhabitants wanted to admit. In the quiet moments between the evening's entertainments, as the guests depart and the servants begin to clear away the remains of imperial grandeur, you can almost hear the sound of those distant battlefields, the mud and blood and suffering that made all this luxury possible. The Empress retires to her private apartments, her day's work complete, but the empire she has helped to sustain is already beginning its long descent toward dissolution and defeat. As we reach the end of our journey through the forgotten corners of Napoleon's empire, we find ourselves returning to the fundamental contrast that has guided our exploration, the difference between the grand narratives of history and the quiet realities of human experience. The soldiers whose boots wore thin on endless roads, the marshal whose loyalty cost him his life, the artworks torn from their homes and scattered across a continent, the courtiers whose elaborate rituals masked the empire's growing fragility. All of these stories remind us that history is made not by abstract forces, but by individual human beings, each carrying their own burden of hope, fear, and simple endurance.